You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're asking whether Britain's relationship with China is on the right track. The British government appears determined to open a new chapter in that relationship. Chancellor George Osborne and London's Mayor Boris Johnson were recently in Beijing, with Mr Osborne declaring that there was no limit to the amount of business we can do together. Visa restrictions for some Chinese visitors have been lifted, and a Chinese nuclear firm has been given the green light to play a role in building a new British nuclear power plant. Mr Osborne also said he wanted to change British attitudes towards China, which he said should be recognised as a deep and ancient civilisation that was at the forefront of high-tech engineering, instead of being seen as a sweatshop. The visit follows what some observers describe as an unofficial downgrading of relations by China as punishment for Prime Minister David Cameron's meeting with the exiled Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, last year. Britain is anxious to draw a line under that episode. While in China, Mr Osborne said Mr Cameron had no plans to meet the Dalai Lama again, while Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said Britain should be grown up about its differences with China over human rights issues. Yet there are other questions about what courting China could mean for the UK. Foreign companies often complain of being discriminated against in the Chinese market. Is there any guarantee of access for British firms? Meanwhile, the anti-corruption organisation Transparency International says Chinese companies, including state-owned firms, are the least transparent among those in BRICS countries. Does this raise concerns about how the Chinese owners of investments in Britain will behave? So, is Britain embarrassing itself by apparently begging China for investment with few strings attached, or does Mr Osborne's trip show a belated recognition that China should be treated with respect, rather than simply being lectured at over issues such as human rights? With me to discuss this are Liam Byrne, Labour MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill, Shadow Minister for Higher Education, and the author of the recently published book, Turning to Face the East, How Britain Can Prosper in the Asian Century; Isabel Hilton, a journalist and founder of the bilingual website China Dialogue, which focuses on the environment and climate; Dr Hong Bo, a reader in financial economics at SOAS, University of London; and Keith Bennett, Deputy Chair of the 48 Group, which campaigns for positive Britain-China relations. Isabel Hilton, I'd quite like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the George Osborne trip to China and his pronouncements while over there?
Well, every now and then, British politicians who lead rather sheltered lives are let out and they discover something that everyone else knew about. In this case, it's the existence of China, which seems to have come as a bit of a surprise to the Chancellor. The Chinese, on the other hand, have been waiting for 200 years for a British trade envoy to adopt the requisite policy of kowtowing, and finally they got one. So I think probably both sides are happy. Mr Osborne thinks that there's a great El Dorado. We've been trying to trade with China since the late 18th century. We've never done terribly well at it because essentially there doesn't seem to be very much that we produce that China wants to buy. We solved this in the 19th century by selling them opium, which we no longer do. The great trading houses were built on that. And we've been struggling ever since with endlessly repeated promises that this is the El Dorado market. And we still sell 3 times as much to Ireland as we do to China. The major trading relationship in the European Union with China is with Germany, which still manufactures things that the Chinese want to buy. So we've seen this cycle of again and again kind of discovery over promising. The difference this time, I think, is that it is, explicitly embarrassing. They seem to have dumped the whole political side of the relationship, which is not a good idea since British businessmen are being arrested along with other, human rights cases. And I think that the Chinese do not respect a country that doesn't seem to respect itself.
Liam Byrne, what's your view on what we've just heard there?
Well, I'd agree with a lot of what Isabel says, but the challenge for British politicians is how do we fashion a new interdependence with China and indeed the East Asian trading zone of which it's at the heart, because that is going to be the key relationship that will determine our rates of growth over the next 50 or 60 years. And it was not that long ago that Premier Wen was in London talking about this simple, powerful idea of the larger trend, the shift towards a more multipolar polar world. And for a great trading nation like us, that's a big challenge. Our trade links traditionally have been with our neighbours across the Channel and the wide Atlantic. And we don't share a religion, we don't share a border, we don't share many cultural traditions with China. And so the big challenge for British politicians over the next decade is how do we fashion that new interdependence? And in the book I published recently, I try and set out what some of those things are. And there are some big win-wins to be had, but our starting point has got to be not simply to think through what we would like out of a relationship, but crucially, let's focus on what are the things that China needs to prosper over the next 40 or 50 years. Because the reality is we can actually help with an awful lot of that. So China needs to build a safety net. Well, we know all about the soft infrastructure, the legal systems, asset management, healthcare management that goes into making up a social safety net. We know an awful lot about the business of invention. We're one of the best places in the world to innovate and invent. And third, we're one of the world's favourite places to invest. And so the key for us is figuring out, well, how do we share some of those things that China needs? And in return, how do we get back some of the things that we need to prosper?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're asking whether Britain's relationship with China is on the right track. With me are Liam Byrne, Labour MP and author of the book Turning to Face the East, How Britain Can Prosper in the Asian Century, Isabel Hilton, journalist and founder of the bilingual website China Dialogue, Dr. Hong Bo, reader in financial economics at SOAS University of London, and Keith Bennett, deputy chairman of the 48 Group, which campaigns for positive Britain-China relations. Dr. Hong Bo, I want to ask you a couple of things here. First, from the Chinese point of view, is George Osborne's trip being seen as a kowtow, as a kind of begging mission, as the expression of a country which doesn't have self-respect?
I have been living outside China for a long time, for about 20 years. So I actually, to be honest, I do not really know what Chinese people, domestic people, are thinking about the trip by Osborne. But I think the majority of people would think that this is a good thing for both parties. And I think they are well welcome in China, and not only from the economic point of view, but also from the interaction, between the two countries, between people on the personal level as well. So look at the pictures that they have taken. And I like it. I think it's a very good sign to make some progress. And because I'm an economist, so I'm also an academic, so I think we need to focus on the economic matter here. Probably in the past, China didn't welcome a lot of, the products that was produced by the British economy. But now it is coming because China is switching its economic structure. So for example, the service sector is growing. And we will see that the service sector will be the driver of the economic growth in the next maybe 10 or 20 years. And the UK economy is very good at providing the services. For example, the education and the financial sector, the consultancy. I mean, the Chinese people are very happy to see those things. And from economic point of view, people are maximizing their utilities by doing so.
Keith Bennett, what do you make of George Osborne's trip? Was it too little too late, or was it enough but a little bit too late, or and what more would you like to see?
Clearly, from the point of view of the 48 Group, which was set up more than 60 years ago to campaign for commercial engagement in a positive way and on the basis of mutual respect and mutual benefit from the UK and China, we can only but welcome the broad thrust of those visits. Isabel has referred to it being an action of kowtowing on the part of the Chancellor. I'm not sure that's really the case, but to the extent that it might be, really I think that the government has only got itself to blame for actually having pursued an ill-thought-out strategy with regard to China in the first years of its office, which I think undid a lot of the good work that the two previous Labour governments had done.
What were the mistakes that it made?
The thing that everybody speaks about was the meeting with the Dalai Lama. But it's not simply the case that the relationship was put into the deep freeze, which it was by that meeting. Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown both met the Dalai Lama when they were Prime Minister. The Chinese weren't happy with that, but they lived with it, and there wasn't any great lasting damage done to the relationship. In fact, the relationship, I would submit, got better and better. It was more the manner of handling the relationship, by which I mean the very colourful and frankly insulting language that William Hague used in public to describe China's positions on Syria, which were, I think, a misrepresentation of the Chinese view. And even if our two countries disagree on the case of Syria, there were more diplomatic ways of addressing a permanent member of the UN Security Council rather than just repeating some of the ad hominem attacks that Hillary Clinton made. And there was things that would have offended, I believe, the Chinese sense of self-respect, or face as it's generally called. There was the idea that among the BRICS countries, Britain would prioritize India and take China in second place. These things were ill-advised, and they came up against a period where China is becoming more assertive and more self-confident, perhaps even rash in certain respects, across the whole swathe of its foreign policy. And it was the wrong policy in the wrong time. And to the extent that the high-profile British visitors might have made any mistakes in their recent China visits, I would submit that it was overcompensation for mistakes that they'd already made.
So I would like to look at some of the deals that are being announced, some of the kind of actual results of this trip. One is, of course, the Chinese involvement in the building of a new British nuclear energy producing plant. Isabel Hilton, what do you make of that deal, and are there any risks attached to it, do you think?
Well, there are risks of all kinds. I think it's just possible that in 300,000 years people won't remember the name of George Osborne, but the legacy of this nuclear plant will still be the responsibility of British taxpayers, if there are any at that point. You're talking, we haven't really had the discussion on the nuclear industry. Why are most developed countries transitioning out of nuclear power or have never built it? Why has there been so much difficulty in finding private investment for these two nuclear power plants? And this is not private. This is described as private investment. It's investment by one totally state-owned company, China, and one by a French company, which is, 85% state-owned? So this is investment from two virtually state-owned companies in two countries that have a strong industrial policy into critical infrastructure in a country that has abandoned its industrial policy to all intents and purposes in the last 30 years. Now, what concerns me perhaps more is that there doesn't seem to be much understanding in this country that Chinese investment decisions are part of industrial policy decisions. They're not ever just about money. So the Chinese will invest in what appear to be loss leaders in order to acquire technology, know-how, expertise, credibility, in order to compete with their own version of whatever the industry is. And if you ask Danish wind turbine manufacturers, particularly Vestas, what happened to them, or Siemens, who built high-speed rail, or, we see this over and over again. Now, we don't have a nuclear industry, so in a sense that's no skin off our nose. But you should read this decision in that light. So China wants to become a global nuclear power exporting country. Fair enough. Are we willing to be the testing ground? And are we willing, as the government appears to imply, to accept a majority investment in future power plants? Because then you really have critical infrastructure under the direction of some of the most opaque institutions in the world, which exist to serve the interests of the People's Republic of China. They have a perfect right to do so. But shouldn't we be asking questions about this? Are their interests necessarily completely aligned with ours? Will they always be? Suppose the Chinese government does something which the British government has to oppose. Suppose it invades Taiwan. What sort of leverage do we have in terms of maintaining a principled objection if we can't even meet a religious leader in our own country without suffering 18 months in the deep freeze? What if it's in some future global crisis? We have to take a different position from the Chinese government. We've simply made ourselves vulnerable to pressure. And I think that these things really need talking about.
Liam Byrne, are we exposing ourselves to, losing our independence, as it were, by offering a very powerful government very big stakes in critical infrastructure of the UK?
No, I don't think we're putting our independence in jeopardy, but I do agree that there would have been better deals to start with than this one, and I'm afraid it's a reflection of two things. It's a reflection of what's a bit of a mess in the government's energy policy, and it's also a reflection of what is an investment crisis in this country. I mean, we still have private investment, about £18 billion, a quarter lower than it was before the peak, at a time when UK companies are sitting on a corporate cash pile of about 450 billion and rising. And So, as a country, we have got to, I'm afraid, wrestle with the truth that we do have an investment crisis, both a public investment crisis and a private investment crisis. And given the current economic policy pursued by the coalition, it's unlikely that's going to change anytime soon. However, in the longer term, we've got to recognise that by about 2020, China may be investing globally about $1 to $2 trillion a year. That's an awful lot of money. If we got a decent share of that money that might be coming into Europe, you could increase foreign direct investment in Britain by about 25%. Now, that is a heck of a prize to kind of turn our backs on. So, we do have to start thinking imaginatively about how we channel this investment in. What's the right kind of investment into utilities, like not just nuclear power, but also Heathrow Airport, Thames Water, those investments that have come through already. I think where I'm more interested is a more creative policy that says, look, how do we in Britain grow with and within China? So how do we begin to channel investment into, for example, tech startups? How do we channel it into new global ventures? I mean, if you look at where, smart money, whether it's Diageo or BP, is going, they're interested in, yes, what can they do inside China, but they're also interested in what can they do globally with Chinese businesses in emerging markets around the world. And so simply kind of opening the doors and saying, please come and invest in a new Hinkley Point, I think, that's a bold decision. I think on balance it's the right decision, but I would rather it was part of a far wider, more creative and richer conversation about what can we do together with China, both in China and in Britain, but crucially together on the world scale, on the world stage.
Dr. Hongbo, do you agree with Isabel Hilton that there is a risk in allowing China to take large stakes in very important industries in the UK? And what does China want from such stakes?
Yeah, and there are always risks when you are talking about investment of such type nuclear power stations. But I think even though the UK is not allowing China to come in, and Chinese people will go into somewhere else to build the nuclear power stations and the similar projects. And so there are two probably types of risks. One is the political risk. As we all know that you basically signal the rest of the other Western country that, we change our attitude towards China. So that's one thing. And the other thing is probably there are some economic risks as well. For example, if you allow the Chinese government to hold maybe even minority shareholders, and maybe in the future you will open the door and they are going to hold quite a lot of UK utilities, the public sector. So there is a debate about this, so whether or not the Chinese people are threatening the UK economy. But we have to admit that the UK economy is very weak in terms of the industrial and manufacturing. And in the world, I just saw a figure yesterday, there are half of the nuclear power station now are in China. So as I said that, if you are not welcoming the Chinese people, they are going somewhere else. So you are left out.
I think no one else has, as far as I'm aware, done a deal whereby China contributes to the building of a nuclear power plant on their sovereign territory. So that is not an issue.
Not yet.
No,
not yet.
No.
Yeah.
China is building an awful lot of nuclear power plants with a mix of foreign technology and foreign cooperation.
Yeah.
And there are quite grave doubts in the industry and in China about the wisdom of the rapidity of this expansion. I think it is as yet unproven that the Chinese can expand this as quickly as they are doing and operate it successfully. And it's the operation that is as much of concern to industry insiders as the construction. Yeah. So there are still a lot of issues.
Yeah, but that's why Chinese people are only the minority shareholders in this project. And EDF, the French company, the state-owned company, is the majority shareholder. I think the UK government is taking a very cautious measure in welcoming the Chinese investors. But I think I remember in the past, maybe 2 years ago, and the Chinese people have already bought something like the Thames Water, So the similar, utility sector.
But I suppose my question is, what are the political goals of such investments?
I'm sure everybody has political goals if they do that on the international level. And Chinese government will be very happy about this because it's not about the money this time. It's about once you open the door and you get another deals from other countries. And I think, yes, there is but because the Chinese government is chasing, the power, the political, bargaining power on the international level.
I think to an extent.
But what's wrong with that? Everybody has the political purpose.
Well, from the point of view of Britain, I suppose Britain is concerned about the weakening of its own bargaining position in the world.
Yeah. But I think Britain can increase its bargaining power in terms of China by maybe getting into the service sector of the Chinese economy, and you will see a lot of British shareholders in the Chinese service sector. By doing that, you control a little bit, you contain the political.
Keith Bennett,
targets,
Keith Bennett, you want to come in here?
Yeah, on some of this we have to probe a little bit deeper beneath the headlines. This talk of Chinese majority ownership or 100% ownership of British nuclear power plants, I think is essentially the Chancellor's hypothetical answer to a hypothetical question. There's actually some very important points that Isabel made, which we need to focus on here in the UK, in that these deals arise from the fact that we have abandoned a national industrial policy, that we have no coherent energy policy. And I think the privatization in this country has actually been a process of nationalization. It's just a different state that tends to be doing the nationalizing. But one thing that we have got right in this country in general sense is that we are more relaxed than many other countries about foreign ownership. It's not so long ago people wondered, wouldn't it be dreadful if there was no UK-owned car manufacturing? There is no UK-owned car manufacturing. It passed to the Americans, obviously, then Germans, Japanese, and now to India. The largest manufacturing company in the UK is actually owned by Tata, and we've been relaxed by that. It's actually helped us. But when you move into nuclear energy, obviously there are specific concerns that need to be addressed, and one has to put a question mark as to whether the government is just being a little too glib about this.
Looking the other way, China is actually quite sensitive about foreign companies' operation within China. Are you confident that there would be a sort of quid pro quo, i.e. that British companies, Liam Byrne says, wish to grow within China? Will they actually have the opportunity to do that?
I don't think there'll be a quid pro quo unless we have a strategy to get one.
Exactly.
I think it's achievable, but China won't serve it up on a plate. Looking at it from the Chinese point of view, why should they?
Exactly. Not on the basis of this visit, it would appear. I mean, there's a very long list of sectors that foreigners are simply not allowed to invest in China on national security grounds. There's a very long list of things which are ambiguous, so they're possible but they're not encouraged. There's a labyrinthine set of procedures that you have to go through, and when you get to the very bottom of that, where you're going to locate your plant, you're very lucky to get away with it without paying a bribe, at which point you're vulnerable to arrest on an anti-corruption drive. There are so many things that needed to be talked about if we're really looking for a partnership with China, and I think this was a huge missed opportunity.
Back when I was a minister, I remember, when we started really stepping up export promotion, we used to have an explicit strategy of the jewel in the crown. We saw the City of London, financial services, absolutely as our lead export, and we called the strategy the jewel in the crown. The reality is there's the crown jewels. There are at least 10 sectors where we are either R&D leaders or we have great companies with huge strengths. And it's those sectors where we should be battering open the doors of trade. And actually, politicians in Britain need to remember that we have a great card to play, our membership of the world's greatest free trade club, otherwise known as the European Union. And we should be using our power and our membership of the EU to advance British sectoral interests in a much more strategic and coherent way than we are.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're asking whether Britain's relationship with China is on the right track. Well, I feel like we've only just started, but anyway, I want to finish off by looking at a sort of more of a kind of feeling type question, i.e., George Osborne said he wanted to change British attitudes towards China. I want to ask, Dr. Hongbo, do you feel that on a popular level, are people hostile towards China here? Do they really know what's going on in China? Do their attitudes need to be changed?
And they are changing, I guess. I can feel when they talk about the Chinese economy, the Chinese people in this country, I think people's attitudes are changing because of the growth of the Chinese economy.
Keith Bennett, do you think people are becoming friendlier towards China as a concept?
I think ordinary people in this country are more friendly to China than the media. I'm not saying our media should be uncritical of China, but I think we're poorly served by the British media in terms of serious handling of China issues.
Liam Byrne, do you agree that British attitudes towards China need changing?
Well, I think that the public's attitude, and I say this as a politician who has to get re-elected every so often, the public's attitudes towards China are far in advance of attitudes in Westminster. And when I say Westminster, I mean most politicians, the Westminster media, and so on. British people are very pragmatic about the future, and people will look at what the bottom line is. So it's not so long ago in Birmingham when we had a huge controversy with Tata's takeover of Jaguar and Kraft's takeover of Cadbury. By far and away, the least popular decision was the Kraft takeover of Cadbury, because that was seen as actually something that was going to destroy jobs and traduce our heritage, whereas actually the takeover of Jaguar was seen as something that would breathe new life into a once proud brand that had fallen on hard times. So I think people will actually look at, where is the upside? And people, I think, see an awful lot of upside in a stronger relationship with China.
Isabel Hilton, on a kind of emotional level, where are we at with our relationship with China, do you think?
Well, I agree with Liam that I think the public is both better informed and certainly more open, and they hadn't forgotten that China existed than the politicians are. But I think probably one thing that I'd like to say is that when we talk about China, we're talking about a fifth of the world's population. This is not one place with one opinion and one government and one set of interests. And I think that in everything we do with China, we have to look for those people in China who we would like, to encourage. Do we want to encourage the rule-based, rule of law, progressive elements, or do we want to encourage the nationalist, authoritarian, right-wing, it's all about money elements? And I think that everything we do and all our engagement, has to be a little more nuanced than to, say, hey, gosh, that it's not just sweatshops and let's cash in. It's just mortifying, the level of that discussion. And that this country is full of people, actually, who have a much more nuanced relationship or sets of relationship with China, and who work quietly, rolling their eyes occasionally when they have to listen to stupid political pronouncements, but actually doing a great job. And there is more contact, there is more to and fro, there are more students than ever. I'm very glad, by the way, that one thing that came out of this visit was that this stupid visa policy will now be adjusted.
Well, our doors are more open to each other than they ever were before. I'd like to thank my guests. That was Isabel Hilton, journalist and founder of the bilingual website China Dialogue. We also had in the studio Liam Byrne, Labour MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and author of the recently published book Turning to Face the East, How Britain Can Prosper in the Asian Century. Keith Bennett, Deputy Chair of the 48 Group, which promotes positive Britain-China relations. And Dr. Hong Bo, reader in financial economics at SOAS, University of London. Thank you all very much.